Paul Romer attained his PhD at the University of Chicago, and his ideas follow a broadly freshwater perspective. He's famous for winning the Nobel Prize in 2018 for integrating technological innovations into a long-run macroeconomic analysis. His paper, The Trouble with Macroeconomics, heavily criticizes contemporary macro. It was written in 2016, where the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model and new Keynesian macro were the mainstream. The main issue that Romer has is that the macroeconomic mainstream theories are going backwards, that they rely on more and more uncertain assumptions of exogenous shocks and facts with unknown truth value, and that the problems that have presented themselves since the beginning of macroeconomic modeling are ignored. The idea that monetary policy is ineffective, at least in the long run, had been popularized by the DSGE modelers, and it's absurd to Romer. He uses the example of the Volcker deflation to make the point that, quote, if the Fed can cause a 500-point change in the interest rate, it is absurd to wonder if monetary policy is important. In the graphs, it is clear to see how Volcker's appointment in 1979 and his policies coincided with the reduction of inflation. The first macroeconomic model Romer opposes is the real business cycle model, which was popularized by Kitland and Prescott. The central identities of the model are the growth accounting residual and the velocity of money. Romer, inspired by Abramovich, critiques the growth accounting residual and refers to it as phlogiston, which is the name of an imaginary substance early scientists claimed existed in every flammable substance. The central issue of this model is that it explains away economic fluctuations with, quote, imaginary shocks, which have no real economic basis, and that the velocity of money identity claims that the quantity of money is irrelevant and will just turn into a proportional change in the price level. Romer argues that if microfoundation was applied to these exogenous shocks, the theory would have never started. Romer continues his criticism by moving on to the DSGE model, which builds on RBC by adding new types of exogenous shocks, which Romer mockingly labels as seen on the slide. He notes that a sticky price lipstick was put on the, quote, RBC pig, but that the central problem that the theory implies monetary policy has no significant effect still holds even with the sticky prices. One of the central issues faced by the macroeconomic models of today is the identification problem, which arises when inference about causality is sought from a simultaneous system. The problem states that data alone is not sufficient for inference. The more variables in the model, the worse the identification problem becomes. Because of this identification problem, to make RBC and DSGE models work, Romer displays with an example how multiple facts with unknown truth value need to be added. These facts with unknown truth value are fed into the models along with Bayesian priors to give the results the modelers seek. Bayesian prior comes from Bayesian estimation, which is a form of statistical inference where instead of looking at data alone, statisticians make prior assumptions about the shape of the data to get a posterior distribution that they can apply their usual statistical methods to. Of course, these priors need to be based in reality, but Romer highlights that they are often not. Romer displays the danger of this tool with an example of a labor supply curve model and shows that, quote, by changing the priors I feed in for the supply curve, I can change the posteriors I get out for the elasticity of demand until I get one that I like. Romer notes that Smets and Wouters came up with a DSGE model that accounted for the Volcker deflation, and following this, central banks began to take DSGE modeling more seriously. However, he highlights how DSGE should still be subject to Lucas's idea of no exploitation, because the model that Smets and Wouters proposed needed 42 facts with unknown truth value to make their model work. This is proven by Romer with a mathematical proof of the m-squared scaling problem, which states that a system with m equations needs m-squared parameters to be solved. In the case of Smets and Wouters, they had 7 equations, so they needed 42 parameters to solve it. This problem worsens further when an all-encompassing variable like expectations is added, in which case the problem at least doubles, which means Smets and Wouters' model with expectations would have at least 91 parameters to specify. In the following section, Romer outlines how economists have previously dealt with the identification problem. Friedman and Schwartz threw away their work that was compromised by the problem and tried to add facts with known truth value to their models. Keynesians set the facts with unknown truth values to 0, but also noted this in their work. Contemporary macroeconomic theorists like Lucas and Sargent began to use maths to, quote, deal with the identity problem. But as Romer highlights, maths never has and never will give truth value to a fact. He argues convincingly with an example of labour market equations that mathematical economics allowed the economists of the 70s to make outlandish assumptions and hide them in their mathematical work. To prove this point, Romer presents a standard maximization subject to a constraint problem, with equations for utility, disutility, and technology for output. He solves it and reveals that there was a fact with unknown truth value placed in the assumptions. The assumption that the mean of the log of one of the variables was 0 was made and hidden well in the maths. I certainly didn't notice it. This is the danger that Romer highlights, that people will simply not be able to criticize modern macroeconomics when their false assumptions are so well hidden in mathematical equations. I've presented the main arguments Romer made about the problem of macroeconomic models, but he also had an issue with the current state of the research field itself. Inspired by the paper named The Troubles of Physics, he makes a comparison between macroeconomists and quantum physicists, saying that they both display the same features listed on the slide. He also makes a point about the threat loyalty can make to science. By taking examples between Lucas, Prescott, and Sargent going back on their own word to back their friends up and, quote, support their friends, Romer criticizes the big players in macroeconomic theory of placing loyalty above the search for truth. In the final section, Romer states that the reason his critique of macroeconomics is not as prevalent as it should be is because of the structure of the research field system. Because he's no longer reliant on publishing papers for a living, he has more freedom to criticize. One of his biggest concerns is that many economists are aware of the issues that he presented, but they turn a blind eye for their own good, disregarding the principles of science.